The sound of skin striking skin echoed through the grand lobby of Monarch Financial, bouncing off the marble floors and high ceilings like a gunshot. For a moment, everything stopped: the hum of whispered conversations, the shuffle of polished shoes against tile, the rhythmic tapping of tellers' keyboards. Heads turned, eyes widened, and in that suspended breath of time, the scene settled into something disturbingly familiar: a black woman standing still, her cheek burning red, while a white man in a pressed suit glared down at her with the kind of authority that had been wielded unchecked for generations. Zora Timberlake did not move. She did not touch her face. She did not lower her eyes. Instead, she stood tall, squared her shoulders, and met the gaze of the man who had just struck her: Preston Reed, the customer service manager of Monarch Financial. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the bold, engraved letters of his surname a reminder of lineage and entitlement. Two security guards rushed forward, their movements swift, but their intent clear. They were not here to restrain him. "You're under arrest, ma'am," one of them said. Arrest? For what? Existing? Standing where she was not welcome? Seeking the same service that others had been granted without hesitation? Phones were up now, capturing the moment: the slap, the accusation, the raw and unfiltered truth of discrimination unfolding in real time. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be immersed in their own transactions. Others watched with open curiosity, waiting for the inevitable outcome, the one history had conditioned them to expect. The woman would leave humiliated, the man would remain undisturbed. But Zora Timberlake had never been the kind of woman to follow the expected script. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm but commanding, her words slow and deliberate, each syllable cutting through the charged air like the deliberate steps of a woman who had walked these roads before. And she had. 45 years old, a widow, a mother, the daughter of a hospital janitor and a public school teacher. A woman who had clawed her way up from the shadows of neglect and doubt to build a financial empire that now spanned the country. Timberlake Financial wasn't just her company, it was her legacy. A $9 billion testament to what could be achieved despite every door being slammed in her face. Her name had been printed in Forbes, spoken in boardrooms, etched onto the walls of hospitals and universities she had helped fund. She had moved money in ways that changed communities. But none of that mattered here. Not today, not in the eyes of Preston Reed. Because today, she was just another black woman trying to open an account. And that was precisely the point. He didn't know. 3 weeks earlier, she had purchased Monarch Financial. Every inch of this branch, from the polished mahogany counters to the heavy brass fixtures, now belonged to her. But ownership, she knew, was more than a title. It was a test, and she needed to see with her own eyes what people like her grandmother had always known. 30 years ago, in this very bank, Eloise Jenkins had walked through these doors, not seeking charity, not asking for a handout, but applying for a simple home loan, a loan she was more than qualified for, a loan that should have been hers. But instead, she was given excuses, sent away with vague explanations about certain neighborhoods and different requirements. That rejection had altered the course of her family's life. Instead of building equity, she remained in rental housing that drained her resources. That kept her trapped in a cycle that had stolen wealth from too many hands that had worked too hard for too long. Zora had never forgotten, and she had promised herself that one day, she would return. So, when the opportunity came to buy Monarch Financial, she didn't hesitate, but she also didn't announce it. Not yet. Instead, she slipped into the bank as an ordinary customer, no designer suit, no statement jewelry, no team of assistants trailing behind her. She had traded her usual power uniform for off-the-rack slacks and a cardigan, swapped her signature glasses for contact lenses, wrapped her braids under a simple headscarf. She became, for a few weeks, a middle-class black woman trying to navigate a system designed to keep her in her place. And now, she was seeing the truth unfold in real time. Preston adjusted his tie, recovering quickly, his expression shifting from momentary shock to unwavering authority. He had played this role before. The powerful man confronting the problem woman. He was certain of the ending. "I've already called the police," he announced, making sure his voice carried through the lobby. "We don't serve your kind here." There it was, the unspoken truth, spoken. A murmur spread through the crowd, some horrified, some uncomfortable, some nodding in quiet affirmation of the reality they knew too well. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Zora exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. For the way power tried to disguise itself as policy. For the way injustice masked itself behind protocol. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The echoes of those who had stood in places just like this. Who had swallowed their pride and walked away because they had no other choice. But today, she had a choice. Today, she owned the room. So, she straightened her cardigan, smoothed the wrinkles from her blouse, and prepared to show everyone in Monarch Financial exactly who she was. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let people underestimate you. Zora Timberlake had not built an empire by accident. She had not stumbled into success. Nor had she been handed the keys to the world of finance. No, she had carved her path the way a river carves through stone relentlessly. Without hesitation, knowing that the only way forward was to keep moving, to keep pushing, to refuse to be stopped. She had grown up watching her mother stretch a teacher's salary to cover rent, groceries, and the unexpected costs that life seemed to throw at working-class families with cruel precision. She had watched her father, a hospital janitor, come home late at night, his body aching, his hands scrubbed raw from bleach and disinfectant, all so that his daughter could have a future with more choices than he ever did. She had learned young that money was not just currency, it was security, opportunity, power, and she had also learned, painfully, that it was not distributed fairly. Her grandmother, Eloise Jenkins, had known that too. She had spent years saving, pinching pennies where she could, taking extra shifts as a seamstress, clipping grocery coupons long before it became trendy. She had done everything right. And yet, when she walked into Monarch Financial 3 decades earlier, wearing her Sunday best and carrying a neatly organized folder of financial records, she was denied a home loan. Not because she lacked the means to repay it. Not because her credit was poor. But because she had been born black in a country where the color of your skin often dictated the quality of your opportunities. That day had set off a chain of events that rippled through generations. No homeownership meant no equity. No equity meant no safety net. No safety net meant a family forever one emergency away from financial ruin. Zora had lived with that reality her entire life. And so, when the opportunity arose to purchase Monarch Financial, the very institution that had once denied her grandmother the simple dignity of economic stability, Zora did not hesitate. She signed the contracts. She sealed the deal. She became the owner. But she did not walk into the bank with her title emblazoned on her chest. She did not announce her arrival with press releases and boardroom speeches. Instead, she chose something far more radical. She chose to walk in as just another customer. She knew the power of being underestimated. She had seen how assumptions were made before a word was spoken. How people were sorted into categories based on nothing more than a glance. She had seen it at networking events, where men twice her age would talk over her as if she were invisible. She had seen it at investor meetings, where she was mistaken for an assistant instead of the CEO. And she had seen it in banks, where well-dressed white men were ushered into private offices while women like her were given brochures and sent on their way. So, she stripped herself of anything that might hint at power. No designer suit, no bold statement necklace, no assistants, no chauffeured car, just a simple cardigan, a plain blouse, slacks from a department store. She even left her signature glasses at home, replacing them with contact lenses. She became Zora Jenkins, a middle-class consultant looking to open a checking account. And in doing so, she walked straight into the kind of discrimination that banks had long perfected, discrimination wrapped in politeness. Bias disguised as policy. She saw how tellers hesitated when she approached, how they offered online banking instead of in-person service, how they required excessive documentation for a simple account, how they subtly, but consistently, made it clear that she was not the kind of customer they valued. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was not the kind of racism that made headlines. But it was there, and she documented every moment of it. She did not get angry. She did not storm out. Because she knew something they did not. She owned the bank, and when the time was right, they would know it too. She was not here to make noise. She was here to make history. Banks are built to look impenetrable. The high ceilings, the marble floors, the mahogany desks polished to a gleam, they all serve a purpose. They are designed to make you feel small, to remind you that power resides on the other side of the counter. Walk into any grand financial institution, and you'll see it. The way people instinctively lower their voices. The way they adjust their posture. The way they glance around as if seeking unspoken permission to exist in the space. Money speaks, but so does architecture. And at Monarch Financial, the message was clear: this was a place where wealth belonged, and where those who merely aspired to it had to prove themselves worthy. Zora Timberlake stepped into that bank on a Tuesday morning, dressed in quiet simplicity, armed with nothing but a purpose. She had chosen her time carefully, avoiding the lunchtime rush, ensuring that she could observe the patterns without distraction. The lobby was a well-oiled machine, tellers processing transactions with mechanical efficiency. Customers weaving in and out. Security guards stationed at their posts with an air of practiced disinterest. It was a scene so ordinary that no one paid her any mind when she took her place in line. But that would change soon enough. Ahead of her, a white businessman in his 50s was met with immediate recognition. "Mr. Callahan, good to see you again," a banker called, stepping out from behind his desk to usher the man toward a private consultation area. "Let's get you taken care of right away." Next, an elderly white couple approached the counter, and the teller leaned in with genuine warmth. "Planning that cruise, I hope?" she asked with a knowing smile, already retrieving their account details before they had spoken a word. Then it was Zora's turn. The young teller at the window, a fresh-faced employee named Aiden, hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for her to see it, the flicker of uncertainty. The subtle mental calculation happening behind his polite expression. She recognized it immediately. It was the look of someone deciding where she belonged on the invisible hierarchy of customers. Not high enough for immediate attention. Not important enough for personal service. A neutral presence at best. An inconvenience at worst. Zora smiled, professional and poised. "Good morning. I'd like to open a checking and savings account." Aiden nodded but did not immediately move. "Oh, sure. We have brochures with all the information on our account options." He reached for a stack of pamphlets as if that were the answer to her request. Zora tilted her head slightly. "I'd actually prefer to speak with someone about my options in person." Another pause. Aiden's eyes flicked toward the customer service desk, where Preston Reed sat in quiet authority. Zora had seen men like Preston before, men who believed they were gatekeepers, who wielded their small positions of power as though they were thrones. Preston glanced up, his gaze landing on her with a fleeting assessment. It was not curiosity. It was calculation. Aiden picked up the phone. "I have a walk-in looking to open an account," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "Yes, she's requesting a banker. Okay, I'll let her know." He hung up and turned back to her with an apologetic smile that did not reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, but all of our personal bankers are currently with clients. It might be a significant wait. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to use our online services? They're really quite user-friendly." Discrimination is rarely loud. It is not always a slammed door or a shouted insult. More often, it is a series of small, calculated discouragements. It is being offered less service while being told it is for your convenience. It is being required to wait longer, to prove more, to navigate barriers that others do not even know exist. It is being quietly, systematically steered away. Zora had expected this. She had not come to argue. She had come to observe. "I understand there might be a wait," she said, still pleasant, still unwavering. "I'm happy to schedule an appointment if that would be easier." Before Aiden could respond, Preston Reed rose from his desk and approached. His steps were purposeful, his authority evident in the way he straightened his tie before speaking. "I understand you're interested in opening an account," he said, his voice carrying the detached courtesy of a man who had already decided she was not worth his time. "For new clients, we typically recommend starting with our online portal. It expedites the process." Zora held his gaze, her smile unwavering. "I prefer in-person banking. I'd like to discuss my options with someone directly." Preston's smile tightened. "Without an existing relationship with Monarch Financial, new accounts have certain requirements. I'll need to see additional identification and proof of address. We have strict compliance protocols." She had watched the white couple ahead of her open an account without so much as showing a second form of ID. "I wasn't aware those were necessary for a simple checking account," she said, her voice even. "Is that a new policy?" Preston's expression cooled. "It's our policy for accounts we deem potentially high risk." There it was. The words were neutral, but the meaning was clear. A different standard, applied selectively. Zora reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license, social security card, and a recent utility bill, more than enough documentation for any legitimate banking need. Preston took her license, holding it up to the light, inspecting it as if he expected to find something wrong. "I see you're self-employed," he noted, his tone shifting slightly. "I am. We'll need tax returns and business registration documents before proceeding." Another hurdle. Another roadblock disguised as protocol. Zora had done her research. She knew the standard requirements. She knew what was necessary and what was not. And she knew, beyond any doubt, that the white woman who had walked in after her had not been asked for a single additional document. She had seen enough. Zora gathered her identification and tucked it back into her purse. "Thank you for your time," she said smoothly. "I'll return tomorrow." She turned and walked out, her steps steady, her mind already calculating. This was not the worst she had seen. Not by far. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what she already knew. Enough to know that the culture inside Monarch Financial had not changed, despite the new name on the ownership papers. Enough to know that her grandmother's rejection had not been an isolated incident but a symptom of something far deeper. Far older. The subtle walls of discrimination were still standing. But Zora Timberlake had never met a wall she couldn't tear down. Discrimination rarely announces itself with flashing lights and bold declarations. It doesn't need to. It thrives in patterns, the repeated, predictable barriers placed in front of some while others pass through untouched. It's in the extra paperwork, the longer wait times, the subtle shift in tone when a name or a face doesn't fit an expected mold. It's in the way policies are applied not as rules, but as weapons. Wielded selectively, designed to exclude without ever making it obvious enough to be called what it is. Zora Timberlake had seen it all before. But that didn't make it any less infuriating. She returned to Monarch Financial the following morning. Not to argue, not to demand, but to press forward. She had spent the night preparing, gathering every possible piece of documentation they could ask for, eliminating any excuse they might have to deny her. Driver's license, passport, social security card, 2 utility bills, bank statements, tax returns, business registration. She had it all. If they wanted proof, she would give them proof. But more than that, she would give them the opportunity to show their true colors. The bank was busier this time. A steady hum of conversations and transactions filling the space. She walked in with quiet confidence, moving past customers filling out deposit slips, past tellers counting cash with swift precision, past the security guard who glanced at her with a flicker of recognition from the day before. The people inside didn't know it yet, but the world around them was shifting. Change was already in motion. She stepped up to the information desk, her voice clear, steady. "I'd like to open a checking and savings account and speak to someone about your wealth management services. I have an appointment." It wasn't true, but she knew from experience that claiming an appointment often changed the way people responded. It created a moment of hesitation, a scramble for information, a brief lapse in the usual routine. And sometimes, that was all it took to reveal the truth. The receptionist, a young woman with an efficient but detached manner, tapped at her keyboard, her brow furrowing. "I don't see an appointment under your name." "That's odd," Zora said smoothly, opening the leather folder she carried. "I spoke with someone yesterday who assured me I could come in this morning. Since I'm already here and I brought everything required, perhaps someone is available to assist me?" The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. A moment later, she murmured something into the receiver, stealing a glance in Zora's direction before hanging up. "Someone will be with you shortly," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Zora took a seat in the waiting area, observing. A man in a golf shirt and khakis strolled in, looking at ease, his body language casual, confident. Within moments, Preston Reed was there to greet him personally. "Mr. Davidson, welcome back. Hear about that business expansion loan? Bryson is ready for you in his office right now." The words flowed smoothly, effortlessly, as though this was how things were meant to be. Meanwhile, Zora waited. 10 minutes. Then 15. Then 23. During that time, 3 other customers, 2 men, 1 woman, all white, were assisted immediately. Zora remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She was a woman who had learned the art of patience, not as a virtue, but as a weapon. Finally, Vivian Mercer, a senior loan officer, approached with a thin folder in her hands, the kind of promotional material handed out when no real conversation was intended. "We have some standard materials about our business services," she said, handing it over without sitting down. Zora flipped through the pages, scanning the generic bullet points, the vague descriptions, the absence of anything remotely personalized. "I was hoping to discuss options tailored to my business. I have projections and financials I'd like someone to review." Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line, her glance flicking toward Preston, who was watching the exchange closely. "Our business lending specialists are all with clients at the moment. Perhaps you could leave your materials for review, and someone will reach out to you." Before Zora could respond, the doors swung open again, admitting yet another new arrival, a white man in business casual attire. Before he had even reached the desk, Preston was already moving toward him, his voice warm, inviting. "Mr. Holloway, great to see you again. Let's get you started right away." Zora set the folder aside and stood. She had heard enough. She walked directly to the customer service desk, stepping into the space where Preston and his colleagues had been murmuring among themselves, their conversation cutting off abruptly at her approach. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying through the lobby with quiet authority. "I couldn't help but notice the difference in how customers are being treated here today. I'd like to understand why." Silence. Preston's expression hardened, his professional mask slipping just slightly. "I don't know what you think you've observed," he said, his tone clipped, "but we follow the same procedures for all customers." "That's interesting," Zora said, tilting her head, "because in the past 20 minutes, I've watched multiple white customers receive immediate service, while I, despite having every piece of documentation you requested, have been told to wait." A ripple of discomfort passed through the staff standing nearby. Some avoided her gaze, others looked toward Preston, waiting for his response. "You need to leave now," Preston said sharply, stepping forward, his posture rigid with authority. "Before I call security." Zora held his gaze without flinching. "Please do. And while you're at it, let them know I have a few questions about why Monarch Financial appears to have one set of standards for some customers and another for others." The lobby was utterly still. Customers, tellers, even security, all of them watching, waiting. Preston's face reddened, his hands clenched at his sides. And then, unable to contain himself any longer, he raised his hand. The slap echoed through the marble-floored lobby like the crack of a gavel. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones rose into the air, capturing the moment. The weight of history bore down on everyone present, because they had all seen this before. In different forms, in different places, but always with the same result: a man in power lashing out. A woman expected to bear it in silence. But Zora Timberlake was not a woman who stood silent. She did not move. She did not touch her face. She simply stood taller, letting the moment settle, letting the reality of what had just happened sink into the bones of everyone watching. Then, with the same steady calm that had built an empire, she spoke. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice measured, unwavering, "and I think it's time we clear it up." Outside, sirens wailed. Inside, the balance of power was about to shift. There are moments in life when time slows, when the air thickens, when the world around you holds its breath, not out of reverence, but in anticipation of what comes next. The slap that cracked across Zora Timberlake's face was one of those moments. The sound of it had weight, a heavy, resounding thing that hung in the grand marble lobby of Monarch Financial like an unspoken verdict. It was not just skin against skin. It was history repeating itself. It was every denied loan, every closed door, every quiet insult dressed as protocol. It was the past roaring into the present with the force of a hammer against glass. But glass, when struck just right, does not bend, it shatters. Zora did not. She stood still, chin lifted, shoulders squared, eyes locked onto Preston Reed's face. The red imprint of his hand burned against her cheek. But her expression did not waver. She had not fought her way through boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations to be undone by a man like him. If anything, she saw what he could not the moment he lost everything. He just didn't know it yet. The crowd in the bank seemed frozen in place, caught between shock and disbelief. The security guards hesitated, uncertain. The tellers stopped mid-transaction. Customers gripped their phones, some still recording, some still processing what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, until Preston, flushed with his own misguided sense of authority, straightened his tie and spoke. "I've already called the police," he announced, his voice thick with triumph. "You don't belong here. They're coming to take you out." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Some faces showed guilt, others quiet approval, but most held the same expression Zora had seen her whole life, the look of people who had witnessed injustice but did not yet know if they had the courage to challenge it. And then, outside, sirens cut through the morning air. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights reflecting off the towering windows of Monarch Financial. The doors opened, and 3 officers stepped out, 2 men, 1 woman, all moving with the authority of those who had done this 100 times before. The lead officer, a graying man with a wary posture of experience, rested his hand near his holster as he scanned the lobby. His eyes landed on Zora first, then flicked to Preston, who stepped forward, smug and certain. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly," Preston said, already shaping the narrative before the first question was asked. "This woman has been causing a disturbance. She became aggressive when we asked her to leave. We had to restrain her." The officer nodded, already convinced. This was the way it usually went. A complaint was made, a threat was assumed, action was taken, a pattern as old as the country itself. He turned to Zora, his stance shifting into one of subtle but undeniable authority. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands where I can see them and step away from the other customers." A simple command, a familiar one, and yet, it was in that moment that the balance of power shifted, not with force, not with protest, but with something far more devastating, the truth. Zora did not move. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she spoke, her voice as calm and controlled as it had been in every boardroom, every high-stakes negotiation, every moment she had been underestimated only to emerge victorious. "Officer," she said, "before you proceed, I suggest you review the bank's security footage. You'll find that I did not cause a disturbance. You'll find that I did not act aggressively. What you will find is this man assaulting me in front of a room full of witnesses." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples of realization moved outward, touching every person in the room. Preston's certainty faltered. The officer hesitated, and then, from the crowd, a voice rose. "That's true. I saw it. I have it on video." The woman who spoke was in her 60s. Her silver hair neatly pinned, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had nothing to lose by telling the truth. She held up her phone, the screen still recording. Another voice joined hers. "He hit her. She didn't do anything." And then another. "She was just asking for service like anyone else." The officer's grip on the situation loosened, the predetermined script unraveling in real time. He turned to Preston. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we review the footage." Preston blanched. "That won't be necessary. She's causing a scene." "It is necessary," another voice interrupted. The new voice did not come from the police. It came from the far end of the lobby, where a side door had opened. Bryson Walsh, the branch manager, had finally decided to make his presence known. He moved with the slow, careful steps of a man calculating his survival. He had seen the shift in momentum, the way power had changed hands without a single physical struggle. And he had no intention of sinking with the ship. "I think we should review the footage," he said, his voice controlled but betraying just a hint of self-preservation. "I can grant access to our security system immediately." It was over. Preston's face drained of color, his carefully built authority collapsing under the weight of reality. He turned, desperate, to Walsh, to the officers, to anyone who might still be on his side. But there was no one left. The lead officer spoke again, this time his voice measured, cautious. "Ma'am, do you wish to press charges?" Zora studied Preston for a long moment. She saw what lay ahead for him. The inevitable termination, the career-ending scandal, the legal consequences that would follow. His life was already in freefall. All she had to do was let gravity finish the job. "No," she said finally, her voice steady. "I won't press charges. A murmur moved through the room, some surprised, some disappointed, some relieved. But, she continued, turning her gaze back to Walsh, he won't be working here anymore. Walsh swallowed hard, nodding quickly, eager to align himself with the right side of history. Understood. Preston opened his mouth to argue. But no words came. He was finished. And just like that, it was done. Zora turned, adjusting her cardigan, smoothing her blouse as if brushing away the last remnants of the battle that had just unfolded. She glanced around the lobby, seeing it now not as it was, but as it could be. A place where customers, regardless of race, were treated with respect. A place where dignity was not something to be earned, but something to be expected. A place where the ghosts of the past no longer dictated the future. She had come to Monarch Financial for answers. She had found them. And now, it was time to change everything. There are moments in life that redefine the landscape of power. When the tides shift so suddenly that those who once stood on solid ground find themselves sinking without a lifeline. Preston Reed had spent years believing he was untouchable. Believing that the rules of the world favored him. That the weight of his title, his suit, his authority would always be enough to silence those beneath him. But power is not what you wear. It is not the name on your office door or the title on your business card. Power is knowing who you are, even when the world tells you otherwise. And Zora Timberlake had known exactly who she was long before she ever stepped foot into Monarch Financial. The bank lobby, once a stage for quiet, everyday discrimination, had transformed into something else entirely. Customers who had come in to deposit checks or inquire about mortgage rates now stood in clusters, whispering to one another, gripping their phones like witnesses to history. Employees, once shielded by the invisible walls of hierarchy, now looked uncertain, exchanging glances as if questioning where their loyalties should lie. The two security guards who had almost dragged Zora out now stood idle, no longer sure who they were supposed to be protecting. And then, just as Preston opened his mouth perhaps to plead, perhaps to bargain, the glass doors of Monarch Financial swung open once again. 3 figures entered, moving with the kind of presence that did not require an introduction. Desiree Carter, Zora's head of legal, walked first, her tailored suit crisp, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the rhythm of inevitability. Behind her, a silver-haired man with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades entangling legal messes carried a leather briefcase embossed with the logo of Timberlake Financial. And to his right, a younger South Asian man, eyes already scanning the bank's security terminals, held a tablet displaying something Preston could not yet see. But it was Zora who spoke first. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice as calm and commanding as it had been since the moment she walked into this bank 3 days ago. "I trust you have the necessary documents." Desiree nodded and handed over a sleek leather portfolio. And in that moment, everything changed. Because it was not just a portfolio. It was a declaration, a final, undeniable shift in the balance of power. Zora opened it, extracted a single sheet of paper with an embossed gold seal, and handed it to Preston. He took it with stiff fingers, his eyes scanning the words, his expression darkening with every line. The acquisition contract. 3 weeks earlier, Zora Timberlake had purchased controlling interest in Monarch Financial's parent corporation. She did not just own an account here. She owned the entire bank. A hush fell over the room. For a long, breathless moment, Preston did not move. His fingers trembled slightly, as if his body understood what his mind refused to process. The words on the page were clear, undeniable, written in the ink of boardroom decisions made far above his pay grade. "I own this bank," Zora said, her voice even, unwavering, "and as of today, you no longer work here." The words landed with the force of a final gavel strike. A murmur spread through the bank like a current of electricity. Employees shifting, customers exchanging glances, phones still recording. Preston's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around, searching for an ally, for someone who might intervene. But there was no one left to protect him. And then, just as he had done to Zora 3 days ago, Bryson Walsh, the branch manager, stepped forward. But this time, his voice did not carry authority. It carried survival. "Ms. Timberlake," Walsh said, suddenly eager, suddenly compliant, his entire demeanor reshaped by the revelation of her power. "Had we known who you were?" Zora turned her gaze to him, sharp and unyielding. You would have treated me differently? She finished for him. Walsh faltered. No, Mr. Walsh, she continued, her voice steady. That's the problem. This isn't about who I am. This is about who you are, who you've trained your employees to be. What kind of institution you've built. And it's unacceptable. He swallowed hard. I don't just want you gone, she said, her tone carrying the weight of something far larger than one man's fate. I want this bank rebuilt from the ground up. Every policy, every hiring decision, every customer interaction. The employees behind him stiffened. Some looked away, others straightened, as if recognizing that their futures had just been placed on a different path. Zora handed the portfolio back to Desiree. Effective immediately. A full audit will begin. Any employee found to have engaged in discriminatory practices will be dismissed. All existing customer service and lending policies will be reviewed and rewritten. And there will be no more of what happened here. A single clap echoed through the room. Then another. It started slowly, hesitantly, as customers, some of whom had their own stories of being denied, dismissed, overlooked, began to applaud. The sound grew, building like a tide, rolling through the lobby of Monarch Financial as Preston Reed, the man who had wielded his authority like a weapon, stood frozen in the ruins of his power. And then, without a word, security stepped forward. Not for Zora, not for any customer. For Preston. He did not resist. What was there left to fight for? As he walked toward the exit, his tie loosened, his face pale, his steps unsteady, he passed by Zora one last time. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply met his gaze with the quiet, unwavering certainty of a woman who had seen this ending before it had even begun. Because power is not in the hands of those who take it. It is in the hands of those who build it. And Zora Timberlake had spent a lifetime building. There is a particular silence that follows the fall of a man who once believed himself untouchable. It is not the silence of relief, nor of victory. It is the silence of realization, that moment when everyone in the room understands, with perfect clarity, that something has fundamentally changed. Preston Reed had walked out of Monarch Financial for the last time. His exit a slow, shuffling march of disbelief, his head lowered, his hands empty. The same customers who had watched him wield his authority like a weapon now stood witness to his downfall. The very walls of the bank seemed to absorb the weight of it. The same walls that had once protected men like him. The same walls that had turned away women like Zora's grandmother. But today, those walls did not stand for him. They did not stand for men like Bryson Walsh. They did not stand for the quiet discrimination that had long been part of the institution's foundation. And so, one by one, those who had upheld that system, who had benefited from it, who had enforced it, who had defended it, were called to account. Vivian Mercer, the loan officer who had mastered the art of bureaucratic exclusion, who had offered white clients immediate assistance while sending Zora home with meaningless brochures, was next. She had spent 40 years in banking, 4 decades perfecting the polite refusal, the plausible deniability, the coded language of policy and protocol. But power does not come from years of service. It comes from the truth that remains when all the excuses are stripped away. And the truth was this. Vivian had not simply followed policy, she had chosen who received the full experience of banking and who did not. And now, that choice had caught up with her. She packed her things in silence. A small box of belongings that somehow felt lighter than the years of harm she had helped inflict. She did not protest. She did not beg. Because deep down, she had always known that one day, this reckoning would come. Bryson Walsh, the branch manager, did not go quietly. Men like him never did. He had built his career on the assumption that power came from longevity, from relationships, from knowing which hands to shake and which complaints to ignore. He had sat in meetings nodding along to diversity initiatives while ensuring, behind closed doors, that the culture of the bank never truly changed. He had trained his staff to recognize desirable clients and to steer others elsewhere. And when caught, when faced with the consequences of his choices, he did what men like him always did. He fought to rewrite the story. This isn't fair, he hissed, his face red with indignation as security flanked him. You can't do this. Do you know who I am? Do you know how many years I've given to this institution? Zora met his gaze without blinking. Yes, she said, her voice carrying through the lobby. And that's the problem. 26 years. That was how long he had been here. 26 years of turning people like her grandmother away. 26 years of training new tellers, new loan officers, new managers to follow the same unspoken rules, to maintain the same barriers, to protect the same system. And now, 26 years were reduced to a single moment: a man in an expensive suit clutching a cardboard box, escorted out by security, his name already fading from the institution he once ruled. The bank, once a place where customers walked carefully, where certain people learned to expect delays, denials, and dismissals, now held a different energy. Employees whispered to each other, glancing around as if waiting to see what would happen next. Customers, some still gripping their phones, exchanged knowing looks, their quiet approval like a slow-building storm. And then, as the doors swung shut behind Walsh, someone began to clap. It was hesitant at first, a single pair of hands breaking the silence. Then another, and another, until the room filled with the sound of something that had never existed within these walls before: recognition. The recognition that something had just shifted. That justice, so long delayed, had finally arrived. Zora did not smile. She did not bask in the moment. Because this was not about one man losing his job or another walking out in disgrace. This was about what came next. She stepped forward, turning to face the employees who remained. The ones still uncertain, still watching, still wondering what their future held. Her voice was not triumphant. Nor was it cruel. It was steady, measured, clear. What happened today is not about individual punishment. It's about systemic change. The people who left this building didn't just fail as employees. They failed as gatekeepers. They failed the communities they were supposed to serve. They failed this institution by holding it back. And now, we move forward. Some nodded. Some exhaled as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. A few those who had benefited from the old system. Those who had been comfortable in the shadows of bias looked uneasy, as if calculating whether they still had a place here. This bank will be different, Zora continued, her voice unwavering. Not because we're making statements or launching PR campaigns, but because we are rebuilding it from the inside out. Every policy will be reviewed. Every hiring decision will be made with transparency. And every single customer who walks through these doors will be treated with the respect they deserve, no exceptions. She let the words settle. Let the weight of them sink into the foundation of the bank itself. Change is uncomfortable, she said finally. It challenges everything we've been taught to accept. But we are not here to make people comfortable. We are here to do what is right. And if you are not ready for that, if you cannot embrace the idea that every customer deserves dignity, that every loan application deserves fairness, that every person should be seen as more than a number, then this is not the place for you. Another silence. This one different. This was not the silence of shock. This was the silence of decision. She turned, walking toward the executive offices, where her legal team was already drafting the next phase of transformation, where the policy overhaul was already underway, where the future of Monarch Financial was no longer a matter of history repeating itself, but of history being rewritten. Behind her, the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. 6 months later, Monarch Financial did not look the same. The walls had not moved. The floors still gleamed with the same polished marble, and the ceilings still soared overhead, casting an air of grandeur. But something deeper had shifted, something you could feel the moment you walked through the doors. It was in the way customers were greeted, in the way tellers looked people in the eye, in the way no one, no matter their skin color, their accent, or the balance in their account, was made to feel like they did not belong. Zora Timberlake stood in the center of the lobby, watching as the bank she now owned operated under a new rhythm, a new purpose. The quiet barriers of exclusion that had once dictated who received attention, who received opportunity, who was seen and who was dismissed, those barriers were gone. And in their place was something the financial industry rarely made room for: fairness. It had not been easy. Change never is. The first weeks after Preston Reed and his kind were removed had been turbulent. Some employees left voluntarily, unable to reconcile their old ways with the new expectations. Others stayed, wary but willing to adapt. And then there were those who had been waiting for this shift their entire careers: tellers, managers, loan officers who had long felt the discomfort of unspoken rules but had been too afraid to challenge them. They had stepped up, eager to be part of something better, something lasting. The policies were rewritten from the ground up. Loan approvals were no longer based on zip codes, a modern form of redlining that had denied generations of black and brown families the ability to build wealth. Minimum balances, once used as quiet gatekeepers to exclude certain customers, were restructured to be equitable. The hiring process was no longer about maintaining a certain look of professionalism. It was about hiring people who understood service, who saw customers as more than numbers on a screen. And people noticed. The media, at first circling the bank like vultures waiting for its collapse, soon turned their headlines in a different direction. Monarch Financial sets new standard in inclusive banking. One article read, "From scandal to success. How one CEO is changing the industry." Read another. Competitors, many of whom had quietly enforced the same discriminatory practices, watched in thinly veiled discomfort as Monarch Financial not only survived but thrived. New accounts surged. People who had once walked past this bank, certain that they would not be welcome inside, now walked through its doors with confidence. Community leaders reached out, eager to partner with an institution that had proved it was more than just another corporate player. Even major investors, some of whom had initially balked at the radical transparency Zora insisted upon, began to see the financial power of a bank that actually served its customers. All of them. Zora had expected pushback. What she had not expected was how quickly people embraced the truth once they saw it for themselves. She walked past a consultation desk where an elderly black woman, her hands weathered by years of hard work, sat with a financial advisor who spoke to her with patience and respect. A year ago, a woman like her would have been handed a brochure and sent on her way. Today, she was being given real guidance, real options. Zora saw a young Latino entrepreneur filling out the final paperwork for his first business loan, no longer required to provide triple the documentation of his white counterparts. She overheard a teller explaining wealth management options to a couple in their 70s. Their thick Caribbean accents no longer a barrier to service. She had not just changed a bank. She had changed lives. But this was only the beginning. As she reached her office, a sleek, glass-walled space that overlooked the very lobby where this transformation had begun, she glanced at the framed photograph on the wall. It was not an image of her in a boardroom, nor a magazine cover from Forbes or Black Enterprise, though she had graced both. It was a black and white photo of her grandmother, Eloise Jenkins, standing outside the home she had never been able to buy. Zora walked over and placed her hand against the frame. A silent acknowledgement. "This is for you," she whispered, "because change is not about erasing the past. It is about building something better in its place. It is about making sure that the doors that once shut people out are opened so wide that no one can close them again." And as long as Zora Timberlake had breath in her body, those doors would never close again.